Hello plant friends, hope you guys are all doing well and staying happy and healthy out there. In this episode we are going to talk about this. We're going to talk about cuttings and my 5 tips on buying cuttings. Usually cuttings refer to a plant that's not in soil. And that usually means that the plant needs some rooting or acclimation process or period. There's nothing wrong with buying cuttings, especially nowadays where that plant prices are just, through the roof. But before you go around buying cuttings of everything, here are my 5 tips. So my first tip is pick the right plant, right? There are plants that are much easier to grow and propagate and care for as cuttings than other plants. If you're on Instagram or you're on Facebook or the Facebook plant groups, right, and you read these posts about somebody saying oh my god, I like this cutting that I got survived, right? And then everyone's like, oh, congratulations, that's awesome. Don't get that plant, right? That's not the type of cutting or the type of plant that you want, especially if you're not familiar with that plant or you're familiar with growing, cuttings, right? You don't want that plant. You don't want a plant that makes the news when a cutting of it survives, right? You want the plant that, the cuttings, always survive. So it's not, no one cares. Pothos are very, very easy to take as cuttings and propagate and grow new plants out of them. That's why, you rarely see that people are posting it like it's news, right? It's just so common because pothos are just so easy to grow and care for as cuttings. So those are the plants you want to start off with, especially if you're unfamiliar with cuttings or you're new to this and you're trying to expand your skill set as a plant parent. Syngoniums, super easy. I find that a lot of pothos, any variety of pothos. Basically, I would recommend anything that's hanging or vining, that you find out there. Those are generally, relatively much easier to propagate and grow as cuttings. And those are the ones that I recommend buying as cuttings, right? Basically, anything that vines, it's fine. Buy them as cuttings, and most likely you'll have a good experience. My second recommendation is that when you're buying a cutting, pick ones that have space between the nodes. I always take it as in some parts are going to rot and some parts are going to dry up. When you're buying, a cutting and you only have this much space between the nodes or the leaf or anything like that, you want to get as much space as you can get. Let me see if I can show you an example. Okay, I left these in roots or in water for way too long. Right. Let me see. But look at here. I'm sure does this focus? Right, there's an area here that's just black. Right? And this is, some of it has rotted, right? Some of it has rotted up to this node. And the good thing is that I have plenty of other nodes that if this, rot were to keep going up, this plant would still survive. And I would just, cut off this piece. And there's other places, other nodes where roots can come off of. When you're buying cuttings, not only do you want more nodes, which means more lives, more opportunities for roots to come out of, and but you also want space, right? Space between the nodes or space from the tip to the node in case rotting, in case excessive drying out happens. You want some space so that your node, where the leaves and the roots are going to come out of, aren't injured. Okay, my next tip is that not all roots are the same, right? So most cuttings that you're gonna find or you're going to buy are going to have minimal roots, and usually they will not be soil roots. They will be water roots like these or aerial roots. I want to warn you that aerial roots are not the same as water roots. Water roots, if you have enough, these can easily transition to soil or a soil mixture. Aerial roots, much more tricky. Much more tricky to transition to a soil mix. Aerial roots are not the same as water roots, are not the same as soil roots. I usually tell people that if you have aerial roots, first put them in water first for them to get water roots, and then transition from water roots to your soil composition. Some people don't do that. Some people, they transition directly from an aerial root to their, soil or potting mix, and they do that. There are definitely ways to do that, but it's not something that I do or I recommend to new plant parents. My next recommendation is root your cutting however way you are most comfortable doing it. I root my cuttings in water, and then from here I usually transition to a soil composition. I have friends who root their cuttings directly in perlite. Others do it in sphagnum moss. Some transition from water to sphagnum moss or perlite, and then they go to a potting mix. There are lots of ways to do it. Is one way significantly better than the other? I'm not quite sure. I think that it depends on the person, it depends on the routine or the procedure, and it also depends on the environment. If you are familiar or you're more comfortable with one way or another, just use that way, right? Like, I don't think that there's, any right way or wrong way as long as your cutting survives and makes it. So my last tip is focus on survival instead of time. This plant has been rooting in here for goodness, I would say like 4 or 5 months, right? And what I mean by survival is that as long as your plant is surviving, who cares how long it takes? Right? Like, even if the roots came in within a week, that's great. If it came in or it comes in within a month, or even if it takes like 2 months, that's fine, right? Like, as long as the plant is surviving, as long as you're not completely rotted over, as long as your plant is not completely shriveled up, that's fine. Let your plant take as long as it wants. Focus on survivability. Don't go around trying to find ways that that you are not comfortable with, but you hear that works better or works faster, right? Like, stick with what you're comfortable with if it's working for you, right? Survivability, right? Not timing. Don't rush it, right? Like, don't try to find a better method or a faster method because there's definitely risks involved with that. That new method that you're not comfortable with or you're not familiar with can end up killing your plant, right? So you would rather have a plant that slowly roots as opposed to a plant that just dies. So that's it, guys. Those are my recommendations for buying and caring for your cuttings. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, and if you like the shirt and you want to support the channel, please buy a shirt and support the channel. That's it for this episode. Till next time, happy planting.